In 1996, a devastating E. coli outbreak struck a small town called Wishaw in central Scotland. In a matter of days, the situation would escalate into the worst E. coli outbreak in British history, resulting in the loss of 21 lives and the illness of over 500 people. This is a tragic story, filled with deception and incompetence. It stands as a stark reminder of the importance of food safety and the devastating impacts of its neglect. This video will delve into the events that led to the disaster in Wishaw and look at the aftermath, and I will share my opinions as an environmental health officer. On the 17th of November 1996, the Wishaw Parish Church held a lunch event for their elderly parishioners, something they had done every 6 months or so for about the last 10 years. For a lot of the people going, it was a chance to get out of the house and spend some time with people that they hadn't seen for a while. The minister's wife and some volunteers had decided to serve a steak pie with beef broth and a fruit cocktail with ice cream. The boiling beef, the cooked beef stew and the pastry were ordered from their regular supplier, John Barr and Son. On the day of the event, some 87 people attended the church lunch. The event ran smoothly and everyone left satisfied, completely unaware that the clock had started ticking on an E. coli infection that would go on to claim the lives of 8 of those 87 guests. Now, on the 22nd of November 1996, the microbiologist at Law Hospital confirmed E. coli 0157 in a sample sent by a 5-year-old girl and found 2 more likely positive samples from patients at the hospital. All 3 patients had addresses in Wishaw. This was concerning as E. coli cases are usually rather rare. Digging deeper, the microbiologist looked through the data for samples sent in the previous day. 2 were from patients with bloody diarrhoea, a symptom often associated with E. coli 0157. This raised the odds that they too had the infection. Both, again, had addresses in Wishaw. This left him with 1 confirmed, 2 likely, and 2 possible cases, all from the same town. He decided to interview the 3 patients that were at the hospital. 2 possible sources emerged from the interviews. All 3 had eaten meat brought from a local butcher called John Barr and Son, and at least 2, possibly all 3, had also purchased milk from the local supermarket. Concerned that the cases were a sign of a much bigger problem, he contacted the other local hospital, Monklands Hospital, and asked whether they knew of any E. coli 0157 cases. They advised that they had 2 patients with bloody diarrhoea, and both, again, were from the Wishaw area. Becoming more concerned about the scale of the problem, he next contacted the local doctors' surgeries in the Wishaw area. One of those had seen 5 patients with bloody diarrhoea, 3 of whom had been at a lunch at Wishaw Parish Church. Confident now that there was a serious problem, he decided to contact the senior public health specialist for the area and share his concerns. An investigation was launched immediately and an outbreak was declared. An outbreak meeting was held between the local public health officials and senior environmental health officials from North Lanarkshire Council at around about 6 p.m. that day. By that time, a total of 15 likely cases had been identified, with 9 of those 15 cases already questioned regarding their food history. 8 of those 9 cases reported eating food from John Barr and Son. Despite this, the possibility of milk being the source of the outbreak remained on the agenda, likely due to an outbreak around about 2 years earlier, which was caused by contaminated milk sold by a small dairy. There was also some hesitation to concretely name John Barr and Son as the source, given that the premises was one of the largest butcher's shop in Wishaw, which was a relatively small town. A high proportion of the Wishaw population would likely visit bars in any week, so the possibility of another food source could not be ruled out. And at this time, there had never been an E. coli 0157 outbreak linked to a butcher's shop, so it probably seemed more likely that a known source such as milk could be the source in this outbreak. However, after much discussion, the link between John Barr and Son and the cases was too strong to ignore, and they decided to visit him that very evening. John Barr and Son was a large butcher and bakery shop with a factory area at the back. John Barr was a member of the Scottish Federation of Meat Traders, and that year, 1996, had been voted Scottish Butcher of the Year, an award that's given based on votes by customers on shop appearance, friendliness, and range of products. So it's safe to say that it was a very busy butcher's shop with a lot of very loyal customers. He was also not known to the senior environmental health officials as being a problem. In fact, they didn't have any detailed knowledge about the business. The records would show that the premises was a relatively small operation, mostly selling meat products to local customers over the counter at their premises. Now, this was due to John Barr's decision to deceive environmental health officers in 1995, the year before the outbreak, by lying about the scale and nature of his business to avoid the strict and more expensive requirements of the Meat Product Regulations 1994. Now, this deception will become very important in the decisions and unfortunate errors made in responding to the outbreak. At 9 p.m. on that chilly Friday night, the senior public health official and two senior environmental health officials visited the home of John Barr. Surprised by their presence late on a Friday evening, Mr. Barr invited them inside at once. They explained to him that cooked meats from his premises had been linked to E. coli 0157 cases and asked if he would voluntarily agree to stop selling cooked meats. Mr. Barr agreed right away. However, he asked if he could continue to sell cooked meat products such as sausage rolls and pasties from the bakery of his store. He assured them that the bakery and the butcher's premises were very separate, and on that basis, they agreed that he could continue to sell those products. An environmental health visit was arranged for the following morning, the Saturday, at 7 a.m, whereby they would remove all of the suspect food and begin an investigation. The officials then left, seemingly content that they had taken sufficient action if the outbreak was being caused by John Barr. However, when the environmental health officers arrived at 7 a.m. that Saturday morning, they were surprised to find that the premises was much larger than expected. They had hoped to interview about half of the staff before returning to their office for an outbreak control meeting at about 11 a.m. However, they discovered that some 40 people worked there. And in that time, between 7 and 11 a.m, they also needed to take swabs of the surfaces and equipment and take samples of the meat to be tested for E. coli 0157. Now, during this visit, the officers found several very significant issues at Barr's. These issues would allow the transfer of E. coli 0157 from raw meat to cooked, ready-to-eat meat products. This is known as cross-contamination. Now, the way to prevent cross-contamination is to separate raw and ready-to-eat foods by either space or by time and cleaning. So you either keep them apart completely by using different spaces and different equipment for each, or you thoroughly clean and disinfect any surfaces, equipment, and hands after they've been in contact with raw meat and before handling ready-to-eat foods. The cross-contamination issues that the officers found that morning included using one set of knives, the weighing scales, and the single vacuum packing machine for both raw and ready-to-eat foods. One of the officers interviewed the factory manager and asked him what he uses to clean the premises, the utensils, and all of the machinery. The factory manager disappeared briefly and then returned and showed him a bottle of biodegradable detergent. The officer looked at the bottle and he noticed that it was not a bactericidal cleaner. Now, bactericidal means that it kills bacteria. If you use a detergent that's not bactericidal, then bacteria such as E. coli 0157 can survive the cleaning process. As there was no bactericidal cleaner available, they were not able to disinfect those knives and weighing scales and work surfaces between the raw and the ready-to-eat foods. It's also not physically possible to fully disinfect a vacuum packing machine, so the use of one machine for both raw and ready-to-eat foods is prohibited in the UK. In addition, they found that raw and ready-to-eat foods were being stored on the same shelves in the walk-in chiller, again presenting a risk of cross-contamination. They also found staff handling raw meat and not washing their hands before handling cooked, ready-to-eat meats. In fact, there was no hand soap at the hand wash basins in the factory area or in the bakery shop, so it wouldn't have been possible for them to clean their hands properly anyway. A staff member was also seen using the same knife to cut raw meat and then to cut cooked, ready-to-eat meats without any cleaning at all in between. The officers also discovered that staff were not using a probe thermometer to check that meat was cooked thoroughly all the way through. Now, if the internal temperature in the middle of a large joint of meat does not reach above 75 degrees Celsius, then E. coli 0157 and other bacteria could survive. Despite finding all of these major issues at the premises, the two officers left it open and trading and returned to their office for their 11 a.m. meeting. At the same time as this inspection, the voluntary agreement to stop selling cooked meats was proving to be ineffective. Despite agreeing to stop, John Barr and Son were continuing to sell cooked meats to their customers. One customer visited in the morning to pick up a birthday cake and 100 slices each of roast turkey, roast beef and boiled ham for a birthday party. The customer would later allege that John Barr himself took payment for the order. Shortly later, the customer was told by his niece that there were rumours that John Barr and Son had cleared all of the cooked meats from their shelves because of a food scare, and he decided that he would call John Barr to find out what was happening. He called and he spoke to John Barr and he asked him whether the meat was safe to eat. And Mr. Barr told him that the meat that he had brought was fine and he should go ahead and eat it. Mr. Barr would later say that he didn't recall having that telephone conversation. However, later Saturday afternoon, it appeared that Mr. Barr had a change of heart and he decided to call the customer back to warn him about the meat. There was no answer, so Mr. Barr simply left a voicemail and did not try to contact him again. The environmental health officers had reported their findings to the outbreak control meeting at 11 a.m. that morning. By that time, the number of possible cases had already doubled since the previous night, and patients were queuing to be admitted at the hospital. The hospitals were already starting to become overstretched. However, there was some confusion at the meeting, as some of the cases did not appear to be linked to John Barr and Sons, as they didn't live in the Wishaw area. Given the cross-contamination issues that were found that morning, it was decided that Mr. Barr be asked to stop selling all cooked, ready-to-eat products, so basically anything that didn't require further cooking. The outbreak team also decided that it was time to make a public statement about the outbreak and the link to John Barr and Son. So the officers returned to Barr's at about 2:30 p.m. to ask him about this and to take more swabs and to get the addresses of any businesses that were supplied by John Barr and Son. Mr. Barr agreed to stop selling cooked products and to the public statement. Mrs. Barr was called in to help with the names of the businesses that they supplied, and after going through their books for about an hour, she had prepared a handwritten list. The officers were relieved when they looked at the list to find that all of the businesses were small local businesses, such as the post office and the golf club. This suggested to them that the outbreak will be confined to the Wishaw area. Later that evening, the birthday party went ahead at the Cascade Public House, and more than 100 people ate sandwiches made with the meat from bars, including drinkers in the main bar who were invited in to finish the food at the end of the party. On Sunday morning, the investigation at bars continued. The shop was closed, but many staff came in to do a deep clean. The environmental health officers also visited again to continue their interviews with the staff, and things were running smoothly until around about 1 p.m, when a staff member shared some shocking information with the investigators. The officers were interviewing one of the store's delivery drivers, and he told them that once a week he delivered cooked meat and pies to 3 Scott Mid stores in Bonnie Bridge. This took the potentially affected area north to the Forth Valley, around about 20 miles from Wishaw, and well outside of these officers' local authority. Not only this, but it involved a company, Scott Mid, which had a large number of small convenience stores throughout Scotland. Any optimism that the outbreak would be confined to Wishaw was shattered. It also made it clear that the list provided by Mrs. Barr was seriously and arguably deceptively incomplete. The outbreak control team were notified and the officials in Forth Valley were told. However, this revelation would come too late for the vulnerable residents of Bankview Nursing Home in Bonnie Bridge. On the Saturday morning, the catering manager at Bankview Nursing Home had realised that their normal butcher had forgotten to send the meat that they used to make their sandwiches. So she made an innocent but tragic choice and decided to walk to the local convenience store to buy some cooked meats. The store that she chose was Scott Mid on Kilsyth Road in Bonnie Bridge. That week, the store had received a delivery of cooked meats from John Barr and Son. Those meats were sliced using the meat slicing machine inside the Scott Mid shop, which was later used to slice the Bankview Nursing Home purchases. The meats that the catering manager purchased were not actually John Barr and Son products, but they had been sliced on the same machine. So this meat might have been fine if it wasn't for that cross-contamination on the meat slicing machine inside Scott Mid. She returned to the nursing home and made sandwiches which were given to the residents later in the afternoon, and some of those were finished by staff members the following day. On Monday, the cases continued to climb rapidly, reaching 68 likely cases, 16 of which had been confirmed by the lab. The national press had got hold of the story and a media frenzy had descended on Wishaw. Despite this, John Barr and Son was still busy with customers, and some customers were quoted in the press with comments about John Barr being blamed for the outbreak without any proof. On Tuesday, however, things would take a tragic turn as the first 2 people would lose their lives in this outbreak. At the outbreak control meeting that day, the senior environmental health officer explained that the list of shops supplied by bars was becoming very complex. They were discovering that some businesses supplied by bars were then supplying the meat to other businesses that in some cases then supplied it to yet another business. This was creating a complex web of information that was taking the officers a lot of time to work through. The list was growing, but they were legally unable to release it to the public because it was incomplete. They'd marked the list as confidential and they sent it to all public health and environmental health departments in Scotland the following afternoon and asked them to follow up with any shops that were in their area. The next day, 3 more people lost their lives to the E. coli infection, bringing the death toll up to 5. It was decided that John Barr and Son should close completely, and they did so voluntarily. The press had picked up on the fact that the list of businesses was confidential, and there was widespread outrage about this, with some allegations that there was a cover-up. Politicians were starting to comment on the interests of businesses being put above public health. And under that mounting pressure, that evening the outbreak control team finally released a list of 56 shops that had been supplied with John Barr products. By Thursday, the hospitals and local doctors' practice were overrun. The infectious disease ward at Monklands was full, so a second ward had to be opened to deal with the E. coli patients. With bars now fully closed, attention turned to tracking down all shops supplied with the contaminated meat. And over the next few days, the number of businesses would grow from 56 to about 85. From the 1st of December, the outbreak was now under control. With bars closed and the meat taken off the shelves in the other shops supplied by bars, it was not possible to buy the contaminated meat anywhere. Unfortunately, the situation would continue to get worse, as those already infected would continue to fall ill for up to 14 days after eating the meat. And those with serious complications would sadly continue to decline. It wasn't until mid-December that the new cases of E. coli 0157 would finally stop, and the outbreak was officially declared over on the 20th of January 1997. By the end of the outbreak, more than 1,000 people in Wishaw had been to see a doctor about diarrhoea symptoms, and almost 1,000 had been tested for E. coli 0157, a massive feat by the labs. Officially, the number of cases linked to the outbreak is closer to around 500, with cases spread out across Wishaw and the central belt of Scotland. 21 people had lost their lives. The church lunch group were the hardest hit, with 45 falling ill and 8 deaths. The Bankview nursing home were not far behind, with 6 of the residents tragically passing away due to complications of E. coli 0157 infections. At the beginning of December, the local police force was drafted in to help with evidence gathering, and some 700 witness statements were taken before the end of the investigation. A massive lorry full of around 5 tons of Barr's meat was sent under police escort to the Public Health Laboratory in Aberdeen. It took months for the lab to work through it. The samples taken from E. coli patients, environmental swabs from John Barr and Son, food samples taken from the church lunch, from bars, and from shops selling Barr's products were all compared. The DNA from the E. coli found in each of those places was found to be a perfect match, in the same way as you would compare the DNA from a crime scene to a suspect. If the DNA of the E. coli 0157 that was making the patient sick is the same DNA as in the E. coli found at John Barr and in the products made at John Barr's, then that directly links John Barr and Son to the outbreak. Staff at John Barr and Son were also tested for E. coli 0157, and 10 of them were found to have E. coli with the same DNA as the outbreak patients. The link between John Barr and Son and the outbreak was indisputable. So the first case to be brought against John Barr and Son was a prosecution for the culpable, willful and reckless supply of meat to the Cascade Bar birthday party. The case was based on the allegation that bars continued to sell cooked meats after voluntarily agreeing to stop. Something that Mr. Barr would claim was caused by confusion about which cooked products could or could not be sold. Don't sell cooked meats sounds pretty clear to me though. Unfortunately, at the trial in November of 1997, the case collapsed due to a lack of evidence. It was a requirement for corroborating evidence in Scottish law. Allegedly, there were several errors made in the case. However, the biggest criticism was for an error made by the senior environmental health officer. On hearing about the meat supplied to the birthday party, he tracked down Mr. Barr at a church vigil and took him to the council office, where he and another officer angrily interviewed Mr. Barr. However, in their anger, they didn't caution Mr. Barr or record the interview or make a written transcript. In the UK, it is a requirement to caution a suspect that what they say may be used in evidence before you ask them any questions about an offence that you suspect that they have committed. If you don't caution somebody, then you cannot use anything said in the interview at a later trial. So that whole interview was unable to be used to support the case. The counsel and the prosecutor were heavily criticised for the failures in the case, and for taking the case to court with such weak evidence. The case reportedly cost the taxpayer around £100,000. The environmental health officers were also criticised by the media for not closing John Barr and Son on the first Friday evening when they visited him in his home. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. It's easy with the benefit of hindsight to say that John Barr and Son should have been closed immediately on that first day. However, if you look at just the information that they had at the time, it's not quite as clear-cut as that. Yes, 8 cases had reported eating food from John Barr and Sons, but that was a very busy shop in a relatively small town where a lot of people would likely have had something to eat from there. The shop had an exemption from the 1994 regulations, as they had declared in writing that they were not selling wholesale to other businesses, so it may have seemed that stopping the sale of cooked meats over the counter would be a massive step towards controlling the outbreak, if bars were indeed the cause of it. The shop had already closed for the day, this being a Friday evening, and officers would be at the premises before it opened on Saturday. It's also useful to consider the background context to this decision. The year before this outbreak, a different Lanarkshire council had attempted to seize and detain 3 tons of Lanarkshire blue cheese due to the presence of a different food poisoning bacteria called Listeria monocytogenes. The manufacturer of the cheese would later win a court case by arguing that the cheese was not unsafe, and the council had to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds in costs. The public health official and the council were criticised by the court for being ill-informed, unduly rigid, and combative and confrontational in dealing with Lanarkshire blue cheese. The public health official that was heavily criticised in that case was the same public health official that was involved in the Wishaw outbreak, the very man who visited John Barr on that Friday night and decided to only ask him to voluntarily stop selling cooked meats. It seems very likely that the failings in the Lanarkshire blue case would be affecting his judgment in the Wishaw case. So whilst I can see why a voluntary agreement was made on that Friday night, I do think that there were errors that were made by the investigators in this case. The first was the decision to allow Mr. Barr to continue selling cooked products from the bakery side of his shop. When we think about ready-to-eat or cooked products being linked to E. coli 0157 cases, the main reason for that would be cross-contamination, whereby the cooked products are contaminated with E. coli either directly or indirectly after cooking and before they're eaten. If you suspect that the cooked products are responsible for the E. coli 0157 cases, then you must suspect that there are cross-contamination issues in the food premises. If you suspect that, there is a risk that any ready-to-eat product in the premises could be contaminated, so the decision to allow certain cooked products to continue to reach consumers is eyebrow-raising, to say the least. So it's not surprising that 4 of the E. coli cases were customers who brought pasties or sausage rolls from Barr's bakery on the Saturday, the 23rd of November. The next error, in my opinion, is that the environmental health officers allowed the business to remain open on Saturday morning after they had observed a number of very serious cross-contamination issues in the premises. At that point, they had several cases linked to cooked meats from the premises, and now they had confirmation that cross-contamination was very likely happening there. They could see that the same equipment was being used for both raw and ready-to-eat foods, that there was no suitable disinfectant available to clean that equipment, and staff were openly not washing their hands between handling and cutting both raw and cooked meats. The list goes on, really. In my opinion, they had all the information that they needed to formally close that business by about 10 a.m. on the Saturday morning. Not only would that have stopped anybody else from buying food from Barr's that day, but it would have helped clear up any confusion about what was or was not safe. In January of 1998, the prosecutor made a second attempt to prosecute John Barr, his wife and son, who were all partners in the business, as well as prosecuting the business John Barr and Son. The business pleaded guilty to 2 offences. The first was failing to comply with the food hygiene regulations by not ensuring that all articles, fittings and equipment which came into contact with food were being kept clean. The charge said that a boiler in the butchery section used for cooking joints and cooked stew, and a vacuum packing machine used for both cooked and raw meats were contaminated with E. coli 0157. The firm was fined £750 for that offence. The second charge was for selling for human consumption cooked meats and cooked meat products that were contaminated with E. coli. The charge stated that many people who consumed those products contracted food poisoning, and a number of those people would later die. For this charge, the firm was fined £1,500, or about £70 per life lost. As part of that deal to plead guilty, the charges against Mr. Barr, his son, and his wife as individuals were all dropped. Following these less than successful prosecutions, a fatal accident inquiry was held. This is a type of public inquiry that looks at the causes of accidents. There's no jury. The judge, known as a sheriff in Scotland, makes a decision about the causes of each death. It was at this point that the extent of Mr. Barr's deception would finally be made public. In his judgment, the sheriff found that Mr. Barr had failed to disclose the true nature and extent of his business to allow his premises to escape registration under the Meat Products Regulations 1994. These regulations were more demanding and would have involved more frequent inspections, which the sheriff thought was a reasonable precaution to avoid E. coli deaths. The sheriff also said that if Mr. Barr had registered under the 1994 regulations, the outbreak might not have taken place. And the failure to register was caused by the deliberate deception of environmental health officers by Mr. Barr. He had paid lip service to environmental health officers for a number of years before the outbreak. The sheriff also found that if the premises had been properly registered and if Mr. Barr had been honest with the investigators, then the Scott Mid stores may have been contacted more quickly and the sale of contaminated meat stopped. But without Mr. Barr's full cooperation, there was no possibility of preventing the sales and the tragedies which followed them, including the Bankview nursing home tragedy. The sheriff ruled that 5 key failures had led to the outbreak. There was poor training of staff at John Barr and Son. They did not use temperature probes to check the internal temperatures of cooked meats. And Mr. Barr did not draw up a cleaning schedule or provide suitable cleaning chemicals to reduce the risk of cross-contamination. Raw meat and cooked meat were not separated by providing separate spaces and equipment. And finally, there were not adequate supervision to ensure that safety measures were actually being carried out by the staff. It wasn't just John Barr and Son that faced the sheriff's criticism. He also called the environmental health officers ineffective in controlling the outbreak. The 2 officers that inspected John Barr and Son on the Saturday morning were criticised for showing a lack of initiative and not giving thought to the significance of the discoveries that they made that morning. And environmental health were criticised for not spotting the risks at John Barr and Sons in inspections that took place before the outbreak. As a result of this, the government made some major changes to the way environmental health officers are trained. And a few years later, the government formed the Food Standards Agency to oversee the way food safety is regulated nationally. Food law in Europe and in the UK was strengthened between 2002 and 2005, which improved the powers of environmental health to deal with contaminated food. And it made the requirements for risk assessment, paperwork, cross-contamination, etc. apply to every food business. Now the requirements apply to every business, but are applied proportionate to the size and nature of the business. This all makes it much less likely that an outbreak of this size could happen again. But unfortunately, anything is still possible, and there are still businesses that do not comply with the food safety regulations, either through complacency or for financial reasons or for any other reasons that they think of. So I think it's important to share stories like this to remind people of the importance of food safety. Let me know what you think about the errors made in this outbreak in the comment section below. And thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to see more food safety stories, please subscribe to my channel. You can also see another outbreak story by clicking here. If there's a food poisoning outbreak or a food scandal that you would like me to cover, please leave me a comment.